Thank you for getting back to your seats. We're now going to move into our next panel. It's titled Confronting Misogyny. Please help me welcome this panel's moderator, Saba Malik.
That will be yours and all the rest of it.
Hey, come on. Oh, yeah. So one quick note. A woman asked me to just say, please ask folks to BART to Oakland and not fly to Ferguson, because apparently there's something happening in Oakland. All right. So this next panel is called Confronting Misogyny. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Gail Dines, who is one of my personal heroines for her work in stop porn culture. She's written 3 books, and the most important book for me is called Pornland, and everyone should read it. Next, we have Cherry Smiley. Cherry, can you just... Yeah. She's an artist and a feminist activist from the Thompson and Navajo Nations. She's a founding member of Indigenous Women Against the Sex Industry, and she's current campaign coordinator of the Feminist Alliance for International Action's campaign of solidarity with Aboriginal women. Yuly Chan is based in Vancouver, BC, originally from Venezuela. She's been a community organizer for the last 10 years, working on issues of health inequalities and racism, patriarchy, and poverty. Presently, she is a member of the Asian Women's Coalition to End Prostitution. Oh, yeah. And Sarah Ma, is that right? Am I pronouncing that right? She's third-generation Canadian-born Chinese woman raised in Vancouver, BC. Her family was among the early Chinese immigrants who levied the head tax in the late 1800s, as well as those who left rural China in the 1950s in search of a better life. She's formally trained in genetics and currently completing a master's degree in epidemiology. Oh, she's so brainy. Her feminist activism began as a frontline anti-violence worker at a rape crisis center, and she continues her work as a member of the equality-seeking women's group, the Asian Women's Coalition to End Prostitution. Please give him a very big hand.
Thank you.
Can we have the first PowerPoint for Gail Dines, please?
Thank you. So first of all, this is not made for 5-foot women, is it? Okay. First of all, thank you everyone for inviting me, and I do have to give a particular shout out to a very old dear friend, Leah Keith, who has been with us fighting pornography alongside with all of us for 30 years is it now? Yeah, it's too many years than we care to remember. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about what's gone on from second wave to third wave. How we've gone from a movement that was about liberation to one that's all about personal empowerment. Or as I like to say it, if I'm okay, fuck you. So what we're going to talk about is what feminism used to be. So This Bridge Called My Back was one of the first multicultural books. So you remember that. Now let's look how they defined feminism. Feminism is the political theory and practice to free all women, women of colour, working class women, poor women, physically challenged women, lesbians, as well as white, economically privileged heterosexual women, etc., etc. Notice how it was about all women. They didn't select out a small group of women. They were very clear that this is a movement for massive social change. Now, what's happened that this was the second wave definition to the third wave? Feminism is something individual to each feminist. This is from the Feminist Manifesto that was published in Alternet. Now, let me To imagine the ridiculousness of this, could you imagine saying the civil rights movement is something individual to every person of colour? Or the labour movement is individual to every... How far would we get if we had individual movements? Okay, it doesn't work like that. Only feminism can be your individual movement to whatever you want it to be. Now, how did we get to that? Right? If you're going to talk about the movement from liberation to empowerment, and I want to make clear, this is not simply a generational, it is an ideological battle. We have to be very specific about this, because there's many young women sitting in the audience today, I'm sure, who would subscribe to that which is called second wave, the more radical. So let's talk about what these two did. And what they did was they normalized neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism was in the air before they got into power, but they really did something very specific. They made it the hegemony, the mainstream way of thinking. And most young feminists today were born in a neoliberal time. They've known nothing else. It's kind of like the air they breathe, so they're not reflective on a lot of the ideologies that they write about. So let's think about Margaret Thatcher. There is no such thing as society, only individual men and women. Does this sound familiar? There's no such thing as feminism, only individual, etc. So what's happened is this notion of the individual has overtaken. Now, in neoliberalism, it's all about the sovereignty of the individual. Nothing exists outside of the individual. In fact, in neoliberalism, there is no such thing as structural inequality, there's no systems of oppression, and there's no groups with collective interests. Now, when they say that, it means i.e. the oppressed are not a group with collective interests, because they know full well, the top 1%, that they are a group with collective interests. When they meet in Davos and wherever else they meet, they're not talking about what they had for dinner last night, okay? They're talking about how to plan and how to basically develop policy for the fact that they do act as a class. It's just us, the powerless, who are not meant to think of ourselves as a class. And the most ridiculous thing is when we do criticize the rich, right, what does it get called? Class warfare. When in fact, when they basically make wages impossible and make people put in poverty, that's not class warfare. Instead, it's us criticizing them. Now, I want to show how this maps on to the analysis of pornography. Because what you have going on now is a battle between radical feminists and neoliberal feminists. It used to be between radical feminists and liberal feminists, but it's really shifted. So let's take the one who really started all of this on our way of thinking. And I still say to this day, if it wasn't for Andrea Dworkin, I would be looking at porn and saying, you know, I don't like this, but I can't quite figure out what I don't like about it. It was her who laid the groundwork. And she said, think about pornography as a new institution of social control, a democratic use of terrorism against all women. Notice she's saying here, you cannot buy your way out of this. It is against all women. A way of saying to every woman, look down, bitch, because when you look up, you're going to see your legs spread. So she saw it as institutional control against all women. Now, what's clear is that all women are born with a bullseye on their back. The only thing is, the poorer you are and the more of colour you are, the bigger that bullseye. But you cannot buy your way out of that. There is no way around that reality of a woman being a material condition within patriarchy. Now let's go to what's happened with the neoliberals in the academy. An example is a feminist porn book. And I want to read a quote from someone, all of them. Anyone heard of this? This is all written by pro-porn so-called feminists in the academy. And they all particularly like a woman called Joanna Angel, who is quoted as saying, she makes so-called feminist porn. My argument is that if you make porn and you have a vagina, that does not make you a feminist pornographer. It makes you a pornographer with a vagina, a very different thing. Now, you could say, you could do a porn where a girl is getting choked and hit and spit on. The guy's calling her a dirty slut and stuff, and that can still be feminist as long as everybody there is in control of what they're doing. Notice what is lost is the notion of feminism as any movement, as any collective action. What is completely gone from all of this is how pornography harms women as a class, both in production and consumption. What we have now is all about individual choice, about individually empowered women who have lots and lots of agency. Now, agency is an empirical reality. Do you mean my agency of an upper-class, white, educated woman? Or do you mean the agency of the women who are going to come in and clean up when we're done? You have to measure agency by virtue of access to resources. And you cannot take my agency or the agency of women who work in the academy, who are the most privileged women, and somehow extrapolate from those women about the realities of 99.9% of the of the population of the world for women. Their lives are very different. And the further you are away from having to be in pornography and prostitution, the closer you are to probably saying it's okay. So this is what is so ridiculous about the and my argument to academics is, if you think pornography and prostitution is so great, why did you bother getting a PhD? Why did you bother getting all those loans? You could have been earning money from 15 years of age. Makes no sense to me. So what's missing here is an analysis of structural inequality within a racist, sexist, global capitalist economy. When you talk about agency and empowerment of individual women in pornography, you're missing the nexus and the dynamics of inequality. Now, Evan, who else best to mention when you talk about inequality but Marx? The ruling class rule as thinkers and producers of ideas, and they regulate the production and distribution of ideas of their age. Thus, their ideas are the ruling ideas of the epoch. The ideas don't drop from nowhere. They are in the hands of the 1% elite who control both the economic realities of the base and the ideological superstructure, which is media and education. Now, what's missing, and let's put some sort of Marxist structural analysis back here, what's missing from third wave newer feminism is an analysis of men as a class with a collective class interest. And in fact, men are the disappeared of third wave. We talk about women, we talk about sex work. When you talk about sex work, what you miss is the John, the pimp, and the structure and reality of prostituted women. And instead, you focus just on the women, as if they're just having sex work all by themselves, right? As opposed to sexual slavery, which is a market transaction between the prostituted woman and the John and the pimp. Now, the new hegemony in the academy, we have to blame a lot on this, on the academy, is postmodernism meets neoliberalism. And what's happened is it's this coming together of postmodernism, which could and did at a time have some radical roots, but once it got mixed in the pot with neoliberalism, you ended up with this wishy-washy, everyone's an individual. So let's begin with where academics are at. So I had the horrible misfortune to be at a conference a few years ago in England with all these pro-porn academics. Fiona Atwood is one of the main ones, and she runs the Porn Studies Journal. And she started off by saying there's no such thing as it. What did she mean by it? She meant the porn industry. Why is there no such thing as it, a porn industry? She said, because there's just so much porn. There can't possibly be an industry. At which point I asked, if this was a conference on the car industry, would you say, you know, there's just so many cars. There's red ones, yellow ones, but how can there be a car industry? There's too many cars. Is there any other analysis where there's so much of it, there's no industry? Indeed, when there's a lot of it, is that not a sign there's an industry? That would seem to make perfect, not in this academic world where there's just too much porn, so there's no such thing as it. However, don't go to academics if you want to understand it, i.e. the porn industry. You go to pornographers. And this is from Andrew Edmond, who's a pornographer. And he said a lot of people get distracted from the business model by the sex. Pornography is just as sophisticated and multi-layered as any other marketplace. We, i.e. the pornography industry, operate just like any other Fortune 500 company. They're saying themselves, this is who we are. We operate like any other industry. Again, Adult Video News. They say the corporatization of porn isn't something that will happen or is happening. It is something that has already happened. So let me introduce you to it. It is Fabian Thiermann, a 30-odd-year-old German businessman who reshaped the porn industry. He basically founded what is called Man win, women lose. They're not very subtle, these pornographers, right? And now they kicked him out because he's under house arrest in Germany for tax evasion, and they've changed the name to MindGeek. Now, just to understand the size of the porn industry, these are just some statistics I culled. 1 in 4 search queries is about porn. Online porn industry makes over $3,000 a second. More than a third of all downloads are porn. And it wasn't so much technology that drove porn, porn drives technology. All of these things you see here, live chats, anti-fraud security, stream video, mobile services, traffic optimization, that was all porn money put into research and development. The porn industry drove technology, not the other way around. And every year in January, when they have the biggest porn conference in the world, which is in Las Vegas, exactly the same time, in exactly the same building, is the biggest electronics conference. Surprise, surprise, everyone's going upstairs and downstairs. Porn businesses, like all businesses, raise capital, hire managers and accountants, have PR firms, and most importantly, interface with banks, credit card companies, venture capitalists, and cable operators. Let me give you an example. When I was in Las Vegas interviewing the pornographers, and I pretended I was writing a neutral book on porn, what did come out is clear is I'm a terrible liar because the hate was pouring out of me and I could barely control it. And at one point, I'm talking to the people who run Real Dolls. And I said to them, tell me, why do you think men use these real dolls? Everyone familiar with them? They've got anuses, vaginas, what have you. And the guy looks at me with a straight face and he says, because it helps men develop relationships with women. So I'm beginning to write this shit down, develop relationship with women. Then I said to him, tell me, have you heard of the film Lars and the Real Girl? And everyone seen this? Right, this is supposed to be a sweet film. A lot less sweet, by the way, if you saw him pounding away in her anus. It wouldn't have looked quite as sweet. You didn't get to see that, right? You just got to see him kissing her. Anyway, I said to the guy who runs Real Dolls, I said, have you seen this movie? He said, have we seen it? He said, we were the consultants for the movie, and the day the movie came out, our website crashed because so many men went on it. So how do we get away from this rabbit hole of third wave, individualistic, fuck you, I'm okay feminism? Let's think about what we're going to do, because unless we get away from this, we are undermining women as a class, and we're giving men power as a class also. So let's think about how we put the radical back in feminism, and this is crucial. Any feminism that is not about restructuring racism, capitalism, patriarchy, and remember, when they talk about intersectionality, radical feminists were the first ones to understand this. We were writing about this in the 1980s, okay, about the intersections between race, class, and gender. So let's think about what we want. There's a pie, and it's fast being eroded. Now notice how tasty the whole pie looks. What liberal feminists wanted in the 60s was half the pie. Notice how very unappetizing half the pie looks, okay? That was what liberal feminists wanted, half the pie. The neoliberals want the crumbs that they want for the 1%, and they will sell their sisters out, as they do all the time, for the crumbs. What do radical feminists want? Do we want the whole pie? Half the pie, the crumbs? No. This is what we want. Because the pie is basically poisonous. So unless we go back to understanding what radical feminism was, and then also, by the way, making it up to date, because we can't drag it in from the 80s. The founding assumptions were crucial, but it's not the same world. I often wonder, what would Andrea Dworkin have to say today about gonzo porn? What would she think about what was going on today? It is not the same world, and we need to make radical feminism relevant to the lives of young women in ways that it was not in the 1980s for today. Now, I also want to say, how do we do this? Well, go to one of my favorites, is Antonio Gramsci, and he said, this is how you do social change. Pessimism of the intellect. Understand what you're up against, but always optimism of the will. And you know what? I like to think of this as the Gulliver strategy. I like to think of patriarchal, racist capitalism as the monster. And you know what? They tied the monster down, bit by bit, piece by piece. The only way we are going to tie this monster down is through collective action. Feminism is not everything to every individual. It is a collective movement that stands on the shoulders of our sisters, and that is about liberating women all over the world. Not the rich 1%, not the lean in, okay? Because let me tell you, if you're poor and you lean in, what are you going to do?
you're going to get fired, right? Exactly. So what this is about is understanding that the measurement of feminism and the worth of our movement is in building those women who have the least access to resources, who are the most oppressed, and if they are in that situation, our job as privileged women is to walk that distance and fight that fight. Thank you.
Cherry, you next? No? Sarah.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Sarah Ma. I'm here with Yuly Chan, representing the Asian Women Coalition Ending Prostitution. We're very glad to be here today. Before I begin, I should acknowledge that our work as an Asian feminist group is not in isolation and represents the collective efforts, creativity, and brilliance of many women and many groups. I was recruited to the women's movement by Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter almost 5 years ago. And thereafter, I joined the Asian Women Coalition Ending Prostitution, who I am here with and represent today. So I am here with much thanks and much gratitude to the strong organizing and political training of Vancouver feminist activists, some of who are here today, and I'm going to ask to stand now. I also wanted to express our appreciations to the organizers for the opportunity to meet as revolutionary movements. It is heartening to see the high degree of agreement we share about the destructive force of masculinity on the environment and on women. And as activists who have worked tirelessly to define and understand rape as a gendered and political act of male violence against women. And this is what we do for the love of women and children. The Asian Women Coalition Ending Prostitution is a feminist group based in Vancouver, and we challenge the promotion and normalization of prostitution. Our group advocates for the abolition of prostitution as violence against women, and we work to build awareness about the harms of the sex trade to Asian women. With the reality of globalization and the economic policies of the global north, prostitution in Asian women has become a worldwide phenomenon, and we also aim to expose its connection to human trafficking. We see prostitution as male violence against women, and we work on this issue because we have a major stake in how society chooses to deal with it. So you must know that Canada has recently changed the laws that deal with prostitution, a change that we have campaigned for over the last few years. Under these laws, women have now been decriminalized in recognition of prostitution as a practice of exploitation and women's inequality. However, the activities of the pimps, traffickers, and now purchasers have been criminalized.
Yes.
Some of you may have heard of the Nordic model or the Swedish model, and the laws that have been passed in Canada are based on these models. What I want to do is tell you the current Canadian context of prostitution, specifically in Asian women, and I want to tell you the story of how we got this law passed. Now, Vancouver being a port city, as well as having a large Asian population, it's a hub for organized crime and trafficking and prostitution in Asian women. But the brothels and the Asian massage parlors we see at home is just a cross-section of what is happening all over North America. Massage parlors are embedded in neighborhoods across major cities in Canada and the United States. This is Vancouver, and you can see the sheer density of them in the urban areas in Vancouver, and those we have flagged in red marketed specifically Asian women. Consider your own neighborhood shopping area, and you will likely see that the massage parlors are very ordinary in the landscape of most cities now. Many of these establishments are licensed as legitimate businesses, such as health enhancement centers. And local municipalities could impose checks and restrictions if they chose to, but they don't. Now, exposing the racist sexism of this industry and providing a feminist analysis of it has been one of the major areas of our work as the Asian Women Coalition. And a couple of years ago, we looked more closely at two particular avenues through which Asian women are widely and blatantly advertised in Vancouver. Two local entertainment-focused weekly papers, both widely accessed and readily available to the public, are two outlets that we looked at, as well as the online classifieds advertising website, Craigslist. But these are commonly used in every city. For instance, San Francisco has the San Francisco Weekly. You also have Craigslist, and you also have Backpages. We found consistently that Asian women are disproportionately featured in these ads. In a sample that we took in June of 2010, and things haven't changed very much, 53% of the adult service classifieds ads in one paper and 44% in the other featured Asian women. And these papers alone profit on adult service listings by as much as $75,000 per week. It's big business. Now, when we looked at the erotic ads on Craigslist and we took the content of a full day's worth of advertising, we saw that over 1,400 ads came out over 24 hours. So you could say that in some sense, a woman goes on sale every minute. Our major finding was that over half of the advertisements marketed Asian women, and in most cases, an Asian race was used as a selling factor. Asian women are branded and packaged as submissive, exotic, newly immigrated, fresh off the boat, young and inexperienced, and the pimps depend on the sexist racism to market women as commodities, all for profit. And you can see that in San Francisco, it's not so different. This is one sample we took last night. The existence of the brothels, the prevalence of the advertising, and this failure of municipalities to effectively challenge the operation of prostitution businesses in Vancouver and cities all over the world work to normalize male entitlement to women's bodies. These advertisements, much like pornography, shapes men's expectations of women, creating and reinforcing the racist notions that men consume and demand of Asian women, like petite or geisha or China doll. The stereotypes serve to dehumanize and sexualize Asian women and have consequences for all of us in and out of prostitution. We all get to live with the harassment from men who get so-called yellow fever and believe the racist stereotypes and insist we fulfill those stereotypes, whether it's a John or your coworker or your husband or your boyfriend or your peer or your boss. And then, of course, there is the very real danger of being recruited to the existing sex trade and all the other factors that compound our susceptibility to recruitment: globalization, trafficking in women, poverty, language barriers, precarious immigration status. When the Canadian laws against prostitution were challenged in 2009 as being unconstitutional, we made the decision as a group to allocate our resources here and intervene. While we knew changes at the level of law are a limited approach to achieving substantive equality, and historically speaking, women have not been served well by legal means, the state has an obligation to respond to violence against women, and we acknowledge that the laws reflect societal attitudes towards the imposition of prostitution on women as a practice that harms women and denies us our equality and freedom. In 2013, the Asian Women Coalition Ending Prostitution applied for leave to intervene in the case called Bedford versus Canada. And this was a case that would decide whether some of the laws relating to prostitution and brothel keeping violated the Canadian Charter. We did this knowing it would be a huge investment in time and resources for our small collective, but we wanted to draw attention to the analysis of prostitution as sexualized racism. And we wanted to prevent the decriminalization of the Johns and the pimps and use the opportunity to educate the public. The lawyer and the 3 women he recruited to make the original suit, they argued that the laws threatened prostituted women's security of the person and made prostitution more dangerous. We argued instead it was fundamentally the men who threatened women's security of the person. After the Supreme Court of Canada struck down the laws and asked the current government to draft new ones, the government came back with a bill called C-36, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, in June of this year. This is all very current. Again, we made the decision to participate in both the public discourse as well as the formal government hearings held by our Parliament and by the Senate. We saw this as a moment for us to advocate for what we wanted as feminists, the abolition of prostitution. So far, the only legislative strategy most promising and designed to advance women's equality is the Nordic model of law, which criminalizes procurers, pimps, and johns, and decriminalizes women while also providing resources to women in general to address the systemic inequalities that push women into prostitution. Resources like universal childcare, a guaranteed livable income, and for us, landed immigration status upon arrival under exploitative circumstances. But we also worried about our position in these proceedings. While the bill's stated goal was to protect the dignity and equality of women, and indeed, target the demand, the current Conservative government has shown very little interest in the freedom and welfare of women, and has consistently favored a law and order agenda. This is the same government that has withdrawn its general responsibility to the well-being of the Canadian public through economic austerity measures. They consistently cut and deny funds to independent women's groups. Access to health care for refugees has been discontinued, and harmful law reforms have been created which force women to stay with potentially abusive sponsors through threat of deportation. These conditions make immigrant women more vulnerable to pimps and to traffickers. And knowing this, we were cautious about the danger of being co-opted to serve a moralistic agenda that we don't support. We stood and we still stand, ready to object to any move to recriminalize women in prostitution. And we also stand ready to criticize the state if they relinquish their obligation to provide adequate resources and aid to women. Now, the bill has since passed into law roughly 3 weeks ago, and will come into effect December 6, coinciding with the 25th anniversary of the Montreal Massacre. And this was a day when a lone gunman shouting, "I hate feminists," shot and killed 14 female engineering students for being women who symbolize progress and a movement. We have yet to see how the laws will be enforced. But what is clear to us is that the framing of prostitution as violence against women is a feminist victory, one with the support of women and women's groups across Canada. The law has shifted its focus to the source of the harm in targeting the demand and represents a fundamental change in our thinking of prostitution as an expression of women's inequality. Immigrant women from Asia come to Canada and to the US seeking opportunities and aspiring for better lives. But many of us are disappointed to find a business of racist exploitation that targets specifically Asian women is waiting for us here, with little recourse for exit or avenue to avoid the sex trade in the first place. As wealthy countries who have declared that we are committed to human rights and equality, I think we have an obligation to do better than this. Abolishing prostitution is a fundamental aspect of both sexual and racial equality. We have only begun to imagine and invent the alternative futures for women. And talking about the provisions for women in the Nordic model are key to advancing women's equality. Some of the resources women would benefit from include prostitution exit services and prevention strategies, funding to anti-violence feminist groups, universal childcare, education, employment opportunities, and most recently, something we've been talking about, a guaranteed livable income. Abolition of prostitution in favor of women's full sexual, political, and economic autonomy is a key component for advancing women's equality and liberation, and it's essential for creating the basis for sustainable, dignified living and meaningful participation for all of us. Thank you.
Yuly.
I don't have a PowerPoint, but I am honored to be speaking on this panel. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Asian Women Coalition Ending Prostitution who are here today with Sarah and I. And if you could also stand, Suzanne J., Alice Lee, Jacqueline Chang. I want to appreciate their mentorship, their sisterhood, and unwavering commitment towards women's liberation. I'd like to focus my presentation today on the structural and political roots of prostitution and building on what we've been talking about all weekend. Because whether we are prostituted or not, as women of color, we experience sexualized racism. This sexualized racism functions as part of the global system that is imperialism, which enables the growth and expansion of prostitution and the sex industry. Imperialism is an advanced form of capitalism driven by finance capital and relies on patriarchy and national oppression to survive. Imperialism is in a constant state of crisis for increasing profits and is only able to overcome each crisis by creating new markets and demands and exploiting natural resources. Wars of conquest and militarization are some of the tactics used by imperialist nations to secure natural resources, and we heard a lot about that in the previous panel. And where there has been military presence, we've seen the proliferation of prostitution and sex trafficking. For instance, between 1932 and 1945, at least 200,000 women from Japanese colonies throughout Asia were recruited by the government to provide Japanese soldiers with comfort in the form of military-run brothels. It was accepted as common sense that prostitution and soldiers go hand in hand, that the role of men is to fight in battle, and that women played a complementary role in nursing and comforting men. During the Vietnam War, military bases in Thailand served rest and recreation centers for US soldiers. Approximately 70,000 American soldiers went to Thailand precisely to take part in these R&R centers, or what soldiers commonly refer to as intoxication and intercourse centers. This was also the Philippine experience with the US military bases in Angeles and Olongampo, where an estimated 55,000 women were prostituted between 1981 and 1985. Incidences of rape, sexual harassment, and murder of prostituted women in military bases were common. Under this imperialist context, soldiers are encouraged to take women as a spoil of war, and the sexual conquest is inseparable from the conquest for land and power. The impact of these colonized experiences are deep and continuing. Thailand, as most of us know, has a booming sex tourist industry catering to the demands of foreigners. When I was in university, a classmate who was traveling to Thailand joked that he was going there because where else can you get a whore for less than the price of a burger and beer? So-called peacekeeping missions have also increased prostitution where they're present. For example, during a one-year UN peacekeeping mission in Cambodia, the rate of prostitution in Phnom Penh increased 3.5 times, while 25% of peacekeepers returning home were HIV positive. And we're left to wonder how many women were affected when they returned home. UN peacekeepers have also been reportedly involved in the sex trafficking of women in Eastern Europe, from forging documents to tipping off pimps and brothel owners. Despite the fact that peacekeeping missions are supposed to cease violence and maintain peace, we can see that they provide the exact opposite by reinforcing patriarchy and neoliberalism. Neoliberal policies are at the root of imperialist globalization and trafficking. Institutions such as the World Bank and IMF impose structural adjustment programs in third world countries that result in privatization, deregulation, and liberalization. These programs promote tourist and entertainment industries and facilitate the greed of transnational companies in their exploration for natural resources and land grabs. The loss of land impacts poor and rural women all over the world, resulting in forced displacement, debt, loss of access and control over their own communities, unemployment, and the destruction of their ecosystem. Women's livelihoods are deeply affected, and in desperation, many turn to prostitution or end up being trafficked. Centuries of patriarchal values in Asian cultures also instill the expectation that women must sacrifice themselves to support their family as a means to escape poverty. When I visited the Philippines in 2011, I met with girls as young as 14 who had left their rural homes to make a living in the cities. Most of them were from poor families and entered prostitution to support their parents. Although when their parents found out, some of them would get beaten by their parents or shunned by their friends and families. The exploitation and commodification of women's bodies is central to prostitution and trafficking. For this reason, the sex industry is central to the development of international capitalism, and it is one of the most lucrative industries in the world, amounting to approximately $8 billion a year in profits. Men in Western countries can now enjoy easy access to young and exotic women from the third world through mail-order brides or domestic caregiver programs. In China, prostitution was on the rise in the second half of the 20th century when it opened its doors to foreign investors in capitalist development. Beginning in the 1980s, prostitution centers had sprung up within the special economic zones such as Shanghai and Shenzhen. Prostitution today thrives everywhere in China, and it is widely known that one can barely walk for 10 minutes in any major city without coming across a sex trade. How did prostitution go from being virtually wiped out during the Maoist period to becoming such a major industry in just a few decades? The government's embrace of capitalist reforms over socialist development forced many women to enter prostitution as a way to survive. These reforms included the conversion of vast agricultural land to industrial centers and the subsequent loss of farming jobs, the elimination of the rationing system, which provided rations of food, clothing, and basic household necessities, the removal of universal childcare and free education, and the cutting of social services. Industries such as mining, oil and gas, and deforestation are not only destroying the environment, but are also affecting women's livelihoods. We have seen prostitution thrive in all industries that are male-dominated. Men today continue to demand for women because of this history of sexualized racism. Mining towns are rampant with prostitution. In Australia recently, there has been a spike in prostitution and trafficking of women from Southeast Asia in the state of Queensland. Prostitution is a common feature of mining sites. These are often male-dominated communities and isolated from families and regular social controls. The trafficking of women from China to North America began as early as the rise of industrial capitalism in the late 1800s. During the gold rush, Chinese women were prostituted in mining sites, Chinatowns, and railroad camps. Tough immigration laws against Chinese immigrants enabled pimps and traffickers to profit from trafficking Chinese women. Most of these men did not come as immigrants. They came as temporary labor, and they had to pay head taxes to enter the country. There was no impetus for women to come to Canada under those circumstances. San Francisco was a main hub for trafficking of Chinese women who were marketed as exotic, cheap, and submissive. In some contexts, such as Kenya, prostitution is seen as a positive development by the state and mining companies because it undermines the social cohesion and tribal culture of local communities, allowing for mining projects to continue. What I want people to take away from this presentation is that prostitution is an issue of women's equality and that environmental and social justice cannot succeed without women's liberation. Despite the long history of prostitution and trafficking, It cannot be a part of our future if we are creating a world that places human needs, women's equality, and environmental justice at its core. Rather than globalizing structural inequalities, we must globalize people's resistance and solidarity. Thank you.
Next, we have Cherry Smiley.
Thank you. It's always really difficult to try and condense 500 years plus of colonialism into 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the territories of the Ohlone peoples and to recognize the Ohlone peoples as the traditional caretakers of these lands. My name is Cherry Smiley, and I come from the Teclatmacher-Thompson Nation, from the Nicola Valley in the interior of British Columbia, Canada, and from the Dene or Navajo Nation from the southwestern United States. I'd like to thank the organizers of this event for gathering all of us here to learn from each other this weekend. I am a founding member of the Vancouver-based group Indigenous Women Against the Sex Industry, or IWASI. We are a group of Indigenous feminists that seek the abolition of the sex industry and the restoration of traditional Indigenous worldviews that value and respect our women and girls. Our group is made up of Aboriginal women. Some have been prostituted, some have not, but all have experienced the harms of colonialism and male violence. There were some women in our group that wanted to be here today, but unfortunately, because of their criminalization and their criminal records, are unable to enter the United States, so they send their regards. In our analysis, prostitution is an act of male colonial violence against Indigenous women and girls that both reinforces and expresses patriarchy, racism, and capitalism. The system of prostitution itself is a hierarchical system, one that separates and ranks women and girls according to race and class. Indigenous women and girls are overrepresented at the bottom of the hierarchy and are subjected to the worst and most degrading forms of male violence. How easily we are abandoned in the proposal for fully decriminalized or legalized prostitution. We are told brothels will make you safer. Well, safer isn't good enough. We want safe. Brothels will make you safer, they tell us. They are in your best interest. A similar line of reasoning was applied to Canada's residential school system, akin to the American boarding school system for Native Americans, also supposedly in our best interest. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. These institutions taught not only Indigenous women and girls that we had no value, but it also taught non-Indigenous people that Indigenous women and girls had no value. We were taught that our ways of life, worldviews, languages, spiritualities, and laws were worthless, that we were worthless. In 2010, the Native Women's Association of Canada compiled a groundbreaking list that documented 582 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls over a 30-year period, recognizing the actual number is much higher. 582 missing and murdered Indigenous women is equivalent to approximately 18,000 women in the non-Native population of Canada. In a 2014 Royal Canadian Mounted Police report, the police themselves documented 1,181 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls over a similar 30-year period, also recognizing the actual number may be higher. We need to remember that our women and girls are not disappearing into thin air. Rather, Aboriginal women and girls are going missing and being murdered by men. Men that use prostituted women and girls, men that rape, men that beat or murder their wives or girlfriends. All of these men are exercising the control and domination and privilege afforded to them in the patriarchal world we live. As Indigenous women and girls, we are constructed as squaws, defined as other and inherently less than, with systems such as the residential school supporting that process. Residential schools were not about the assimilation of Indigenous peoples into white society. Residential schools were about the genocide of Indigenous peoples. Children in these schools were set up for quick deaths or slow deaths. Quick deaths in the schools, and we know this because many residential schools had graveyards in the same location for ease of burying the children who were murdered or killed through abuse or neglect. The children that survived were set up for slow and painful deaths as adults through loss of lands, culture and language, health problems and disability, prostitution, high rates of suicide, male violence against women, and apprehension of children by the state, poverty, criminalization, and incarceration, and then offered drugs and alcohol as a means to cope with the pain we endure. All of this, with the best of intentions, moved these children into schools, moved them over here, moved them into institutions. Prostitution teaches non-Native people and Indigenous women and girls that we are disposable in life. The inaction by our governments and the growing list of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls teaches us that we are disposable even in death. The imposition of patriarchy into our communities has had devastating and deadly effects for Aboriginal women and girls. The legal imposition of patriarchy into Indigenous communities was facilitated by the creation of the Indian Act in 1876, a piece of Canadian legislation that continues to affect us today. The Sexist Indian Act defined who is and who is not a status Indian and created rights that only status Indians were entitled to. It reflected patriarchal values and interfered with the life-giving transmission of culture from grandmother to mother to daughter by affording men more ability to pass down status and by taking away the official Indian status of women who married non-Native men. The colonial reserve system is also governed by the Indian Act, and that system has forcibly removed us from the expanse of our traditional territories and confined us to small pockets of reserve land, stealing what was by birthright ours and buying and selling and exploiting our lands as if they were products. Move the Indians over here onto the reserves for their own safety and for our safety. We hear the same rhetoric used in support of decriminalized or legalized prostitution. Move the women over here into brothels for their own safety. Foreign systems of governance in the forms of male-dominated chief and band councils were imposed, and Indigenous women and girls continue to bear the consequences of patriarchy in the form of high rates of rape, incest, and sexual and physical assault, not only from white men and non-Native men, but also from Native men in our own families and communities. The system of prostitution itself was brought to Canada by white settler men, originally in the form of Indigenous country wives, and brothels set up around trading posts and military bases. I have yet to come across an Indigenous language that has a word for prostitution in its lexicon. My grandma says there is no word in our language for prostitution, and this is because prostitution is a system that was imposed on Indigenous communities and that requires systemic inequalities to exist and flourish. Prostitution did not exist pre-contact and is not a traditional practice among the Indigenous peoples I have encountered. We are well aware of the environmental destruction that capitalism causes. Capitalism demands profit first and at all costs, and we can see that evidence in the theft and destruction of our homelands. We can all see the danger in supporting the construction of more pipelines. It's obvious greed will not regulate itself and is certainly not thinking ahead for the well-being of our future generations. Supporting the full decriminalization or the legalization of prostitution is supporting a new pipeline, a pipeline that will funnel our daughters into an institution that has no interest in freedom or safety for women or girls. It's no coincidence that rates of prostitution are high around mining and other camps up north, as the commodification of our lands accompanies the rape of Indigenous women and girls. You must make the connection between the earth and Indigenous women and girls. We are tied to each other, the women and the land. Our cultures, our languages, our ways of knowing and being are intimately tied to our lands. We need those connections to survive and thrive as Indigenous women. We need to know where we come from, and we need to have somewhere to come back to. We are connected to each other. We need to be connected to each other, to our cultures, and to all our relations. The end of a rape culture and restoration of a rape culture, the end of a rape culture and restoration of a culture where women have the right to say no, and men create a new definition of masculinity that is kind, caring, and loving, as we as Indigenous women and girls are valued and loved, and our inalienable rights to our lands, languages, and cultures are respected, and prostitution is not seen as inevitable. This is the type of world I want to live in. I am fortunate. I can hear echoes of that world in my grandma's stories. My blood carries memories of a world where the systemic rape, oppression, and murder of women and girls did not exist. And I'm asking you to trust me, to trust us, and to believe that prostitution is not inevitable and that our freedom is possible. And I say our freedom because we reject the whitewashed individual empowerment rhetoric and the racist disregard for the collective worldviews of Indigenous peoples this rhetoric promotes. This individualized worldview that defines freedom as the ability to do whatever you want disregards the larger structural inequalities at play and encourages some of us to enjoy the privilege of not being in prostitution at the expense of the hundreds of thousands of women and girls around the world who do not have that luxury. It assumes prostitution has always existed, which is untrue, and that it will always exist, which is also untrue. So we might as well accept it. What a defeatist attitude. We have the ability to change and to grow and to create a new world for our future generations. The abolitionist position is a hopeful one. It looks at men's behavior and says men can change their behavior. We firmly believe that men can be kind and loving and caring, and I know this because I know good men. And some of these men are here today. Prostitution affects all of us. It both affects and reflects how men think about women and how women think about ourselves. I encourage all of us to imagine a collective freedom where no woman or girl is abandoned to prostitution and where no man thinks paying to sexually use a woman or girl is acceptable behavior. We can create this world. We have a responsibility to each other as women, as mothers, as daughters, as grandmothers to stand up. We have a history as feminists, or we have benefited from the history of courageous feminists who have opened doors, blockaded roads, broken down barriers, offered their hands and their homes, and laid down their lives for the good of us all. We have a responsibility to be brave, even when our voices and our hands shake, even when we are outnumbered millions to one. And as prostitution abolitionists, we are most certainly outnumbered as we confront a billion-dollar pornography and prostitution industry that has every reason to attempt to sustain the patriarchal status quo. We have a responsibility when we see injustice to speak out against that injustice, and we have a responsibility to think ahead for our future generations. We have a responsibility to consider the language we use, and we heard Gail mention the term sex worker. We reject that term as it hides so many inequalities, especially when we're talking about Aboriginal women and girls. We also have the responsibility to take the opportunity to at least consider critiques and disagreements to further our analysis. And I'm talking about the earlier panel today. And what I saw here was an opportunity missed to consider a valid criticism not only about the language we use to describe the destruction of our environment, but a further examination of your white privilege and the privilege of men to ignore women's histories and analysis. I hope we will all continue the discussion about the language we use in our activism for all of our benefit. It is important to remember that in all the work we do, whatever our focus, we must center the knowledge and leadership of feminist women and feminist Indigenous women and feminist women of color and address violence against women in all forms. How effective can we be if one half of a revolution ignores their male privilege at the expense of the lives, well-being, and full participation of the other half? How effective can we be if one half of a revolution is encouraged to rape the other half? There is no revolution without women. While not perfect, the legislation that is currently in the process, has been adopted in Canada, is a step in the right direction. It criminalizes the prostitution buyer, and this is very important as our laws help to influence social norms. What we want is social change. We want men to decide for themselves that using pornography or buying women and girls in prostitution or going to strip clubs is not acceptable behavior. Unfortunately, the proposed legislation still allows for the criminalization of women in certain areas, and this section of the law must be removed, as it will be used to criminalize women prostituted on the street who are disproportionately poor and Indigenous. The funding that has been announced so far is most certainly not enough to provide comprehensive exiting and preventative services or a substantial public education campaign, but it is a start. The Swedish model of prostitution policy gives us our best hope in working toward the abolition of prostitution. As Indigenous women, we recognize the contradiction in looking toward the colonial state for a solution. However, we are not simply talking about a law and order agenda imposed from the top down. We are talking instead about working towards true and meaningful social change, working toward an equitable society where men choose not to exploit the inequality of others, and women and girls have access to free and unconstrained choices. We firmly believe in the possibility of true and just leadership. I believe the old people, as my grandma calls them, our ancestors, had responsible leadership in our Indigenous communities. As a young Aboriginal woman said to me once, despite all we have endured as Indigenous women, the violence and the residential schools and everything, we can still love. We are strong and we are proud. We carry values and beliefs that benefit us all. We can reimagine leadership in a way that truly works in our interests and is invested in equality. There is hope in imagining new forms of leadership. There is no hope in fully decriminalized or legalized prostitution. No hope in putting all of our faith in a capitalist economy where greed comes first and profit comes at any cost, where patriarchy celebrates male violence against women and our freedom is so constrained that even talking about the possibility of a world without prostitution is considered threatening and controversial. The feminists who have come before me have taught me there is always hope. My family has taught me that even in the darkest times, we can still laugh and we can still love. The love that I have for my friends and my family, for women that I know and don't know, for men that I know and don't know, the love that I have for our future generations, for my people, my ancestors, and my lands, waters, and skies forms the foundation of our struggle. And you, all of you, my beautiful brothers and sisters, are worth fighting for. Thank you.
I've spent a lot of today crying. I don't know about anyone else. From Chris Hedges onwards, you said something about the revolution won't happen without women. I think the revolution will be led by women, actually. So we have 3 questions from the audience. I think the first one was answered, but I'm going to ask it anyway in case you want to just embellish a little bit. And the first question is, in what ways are misogyny and ecocide linked? In what ways do they differ? And how can we ensure that the comparison is made with respect to survivors? Who would like to be first with that? I don't mind. Whoever wants to take that question. See? We're so nice.
Yeah. Hello? Oh. Okay. So I think it is so important that we are constantly making the connections, as we have all weekend, between patriarchy, capitalism, misogyny, racism, colonialism, all of these systems that are so damaging in so many ways. So as an Indigenous woman, for me, the connection, I'm always talking about I'm always talking about my lands. I'm always talking about my skies and my waters and all of my non-human relatives. As Aboriginal people in Canada, when we say all our relations, we literally mean that, all of our relations. So this includes our human relatives and our non-human relatives as well. So I fundamentally start from that point, and I think that we really need to, people really need to attempt, it's hard, I think, because I don't know what it's like to not think that way. So it's natural to me to be addressing all of those issues at once. And so I think that some of the ways that people can begin to do that, I remember once being in a class, and the professor had asked everybody in the class to chart their own family histories. And I was so saddened to see that so many people had no idea where they had come from. They had their connection to themselves and their cultures and their lands were stretched so thin that they didn't even know where their grandma was from, or their great-grandma, or their great-great-grandma. So I think one of the ways to begin that is for people to begin to look at their own histories and connecting with themselves. And at the same time, these indigenous worldviews that we have, I think, are belief systems and structures that non-indigenous people should be ascribing to and should be using. So I guess that's my answer.
Does anybody else want to take that on, or shall I move to the second question? Okay. Next question. There are some privileged white women who enter into the pornography industry and become apologists for it, like the woman from Duke University. They speak about it as sexual liberation and free choice, and advocate for legalization and regulation. What is your response to these arguments that women who freely choose should be allowed to work in the sex industry and should be legally protected? And I think we can say the same for prostitution, because there's lots of neoliberal feminists who call it sex work. So who would like to take that?
I think it's a really interesting example that was brought up with the women from Duke, because whoever asked that question did not see what happened to her. There was nothing privileged in that woman. She was outed. Belle Knox, her real name is Miriam Weeks. She was outed by a classmate. So we actually found the stuff that happened. Has anyone ever seen what she was actually in? She was on a site called Facial Abuse. She was basically strangled to the point that she virtually passed out, right, with hands and a penis. She was crying, she was pushing the guy away, and he was mocking her. And when you looked, she self-mutilates. Her legs were completely mutilated. She'd been doing it for years, you could see. And what I think is going to happen is this young woman is going to kill herself, basically, that she has been pushed out by the industry to represent the industry. These women you hear saying that they love sex and that they're pro-porn, wait for 5 years, wait till they've been used up, spat out, then circle back to them, and those who are still alive will be able to tell you a very different story. So even if they go in with some privilege, it takes 2 minutes to strip that privilege away from her and to basically deliver her up just the same way as they do for all the women. So that would be my answer to that.
Our campaign in Canada has been more about not shifting the focus away from women's so-called choice to participate in prostitution to looking at men's choice in buying women in prostitution. And I don't think we can talk about the choice to prostitute unless we know that there's a choice not to prostitute. And I think we have to look at that choice. Are women able not to choose to prostitute?
Wanted to add to that is we can't really, say that women have a choice when they're making, a constrained choice based on the circumstances and conditions of their life, and we have to acknowledge the fact that the only people who really have power or who are satisfying their own sexual demands are the men, or the pimps, or the buyers. So we want to change the discourse and the focus on the men rather than looking at it as a choice for women to be sexually liberated.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sarah for sure that we need to be talking about men's choices in this conversation, but there's so few women. I mean, it's such a myth that there's all these women, quitting their jobs as, judges and lawyers and academics to go, down on the street and engage in prostitution. It's just not realistic. But I believe it was Lee Lakeman, who is a wonderful feminist and a friend of mine and a mentor, who said, if she really, truly, truly does have a choice, choose something different. because she owes it to us.
And just supposing there are those 3 women who make a choice, right? Even if they don't know what they're choosing for. Like, nobody can be prepared for what is going to happen to you that first day on the set or with that first John. So even if there is, for those tiny percentage, it doesn't matter, because there's no way you can catapult yourself into the future to understand the physical and the psychological and the traumatic impact that it's going to have on you to go into the sex industry.
So this is some of it if covered. If you don't want to answer this question, you don't have to. It's similar. It says, how do I convince people that legislation and legalization of prostitution increases violence against women and human trafficking? It's similar, but there's some difference too.
Well, one of the things that you can talk about is that for a lot of North America, we basically already have legalized brothels. And disproportionately, those brothels market and sell Asian women. And if those brothels if those brothels cannot make the situation safe for Asian women, they're not going to work for anybody else. There's no, and all over North America, there have been documented injuries and deaths of Asian women. Its relation to organized crime is very clear. And no number of panic buttons or bodyguards or cameras are going to make brothels safe for women. And that's what we see as a coalition of Asian women that has been looking at this issue for a long time. The other thing that you can bring up is the situation in countries that have legalized prostitution, such as Amsterdam or Germany, there's New Zealand, they've decriminalized, there's Australia. All of those countries have a thriving sex industry, and you require that existing sex industry to funnel, it creates the demand, it creates the funnel for girls and women to fall into, but it also creates a demand for women from outside to be trafficked into those countries. And in all of those countries, the NGOs there report massive trafficking, and the only thing that they can, the other thing too is in terms of the propaganda from the health research community. Their solution is to provide condoms. Well, there is no condom usage with no power to negotiate that condom usage. And anyways, why are we framing this in terms purely in terms of disease prevention, when really this is an issue of women's equality and of women's safety? So those are some of the arguments I think that you can use.
And can I just ask the average age of trafficked, as we call it, trafficked girls?
Because in America, it's 12.
12.
That's your entry into...
12. My daughter's right here. She's 11.
It's African-American women as well in the United States.
That's not a choice. That's not a meaningful choice. She didn't have a choice. 12.
It's true. I just want to add really quickly. I mean, I don't think that there's any numbers specifically on the average age of entry for Aboriginal women and girls into prostitution, but I just know from my own communities and from the stories that I've heard and the stories that I've gathered is that the average age of entry is much younger. So we're looking at 10, 11. You know, we hear stories of young girls at 6, 7 years old who are being sold into prostitution or recruited and kidnapped basically by pimps and put out on the streets. And I just want to add really quickly that we need to look at if we look at legalized capitalism, or legalized prostitution, we had a really great panel earlier about capitalism and how competition is so important to the system of capitalism. So if we're creating legalized brothels, we're basically giving both a societal green light to men to go ahead and purchase, but then you create this system of competition between brothels where they're trying to undercut each other, they're trying to increase their profit, making women do more extreme acts for less money. We see in Germany flat rate brothels where men pay a flat rate and they go in and can use women for as long as they want in whatever ways they want. So it's important to note that as well.
the best example is Germany. Right, without doubt, if you look what's going on in Germany, you have the flat rate. On average, they found that women are servicing sometimes 100 guys a day. It's a 24-hour on. You've got no time off. For the World Cup, when it was in Germany, they imported 40,000 prostitutes from Eastern Europe, and they set them to work in bathrooms all over Germany to service all the guys coming in from Europe for the World Cup. Germany is an absolute disaster of what has happened. You need look no further than there, how it has become a home to traffickers and the abuse of women. So that's definitely an answer, is Germany.
So we only have a minute left, and the last question says, what are we to do with phallic women in power, such as Hillary Clinton? And I don't know whether anybody wants to say anything about that, but we have a minute.
Well, I don't think we can put our trust in electoral politics or our politicians. History has shown us time and again that, the real social and political transformation comes from the base up, and that's what we have to do. And we have to, we've been talking about this all weekend, we have to organize, but we also just want to talk about this ideal of dual power and what Derek was talking about this morning in terms of the fear that people have about short-term loss. Just not being able to see in the short term what can we gain from committing ourselves to a long-term struggle. And I've been fortunate enough to visit places where the movements for national liberation are quite advanced, and the only way that people are really going to sacrifice the comfort of living within capitalism is to create alternative institutions that are placing values on human needs, alternative institutions of working class power, practices and ideologies that truly liberate people, and where people have the ability to create and build a community where they actually get a taste of what it feels like to be liberated. I know that sounds really abstract, but it starts really small. It starts from building a collective, from building, clinics for working class people, alternative institutions of schooling for young kids to learn about people's history and what power they really have.
Amen to that. And can we give a standing ovation to these incredible women? They do some incredible work. Thank you.